بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما رب يسر ولا تعسر وتمم بالخير وبك نستعين يا فتاح. Alhamdulillah, today's workshop is on Introduction to Translating the Qur'an. And in this lecture, we are going to be discussing some preliminary points related to the Qur'an itself, the audiences of the Qur'an, some points related to conditions, shurut, required to do tarjuma, which is translation. And as we will see, it's an extension of tafsir. And also at the end, we will go over some examples of translation mistakes that have occurred in English translations. And so the talk will begin with discussing the fact that the Qur'an was revealed. So taking a step back from this very specific topic of translating the Qur'an, we go back to how it was originally received. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was, even prior to the Qur'an coming through the medium of Jibreel alayhi salam, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Hanif. He was being prepared to be receptive to the Qur'an, in the fact that he was having true dreams, in the fact that he was retreating to the cave, and that was all leading up to Iqra. And so certain events, you cannot describe them fully. Even if you wanted to, individuals who have not experienced that cannot fully comprehend that unless they have experienced it. Think about describing color to someone who is blind. Is going to be, you can convey some aspect of that color to someone who is blind, but wahi, revelation to Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is a phenomena that is very specific to him. No one else is going to experience wahi. That door of wahi is closed with Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But we do see glimpses of how this phenomena occurred to Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam in different forms. One time, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was lying with his head resting on Zayd radiallahu anhu's lap, and at that moment, wahi descended onto Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so Zayd describes to us that he felt that his leg was going to snap and break because of the weight of wahi, which shows us the strength of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know, when we speak about Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam being physically strong, we don't just say that tabarrukan. He was actually very physically strong. When there was a time in which Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was riding a camel, and wahi was descending on him, and the camel had to kneel due to the weight of revelation. Aisha radiallahu anha describes Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam on a cold day, that when wahi was being revealed to him, sweat on his brow. So this experience of wahi is very specific to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And it was revealed to the heart of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam over a span of 23 years. And there is no authorial input. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam could not control what was being revealed to him, nor could anyone else after him. And so this is how we view the Qur'an. But then we get to the Qur'an in translation. The audience of the Qur'an is Muslim. Right? Islam is a religion of a huge percentage of global population. And what do we as Muslims believe? We believe that the Qur'an is the last revealed scripture. The purpose of this scripture is hidayah, guiding humanity to the path that Allah Ta'ala has set out for those who want to procure and access His Nur and Rahmah. Along with that, as Muslims believe Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is the model to follow as the last messenger, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And so the Qur'an, as well as primary texts of Seerah, Sunnah, of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam are all in what we call in English classical Arabic. But that classical Arabic is spoken by a relatively small percentage of Muslims, right? If you want to say, about 15-20% of the Muslim population speak Arabic as their mother tongue, and amongst that 15-20%, a small percentage understand classical Arabic. Not all that speak Arabic as their mother tongue understand the classical Arabic. And so Dr. Shukri was here a few weeks ago and spoke about the fact of Arabic as a tool for learning Islam. And so there's a reason why Arabs have to learn Arabic, to study the classical ulum and sciences. As for the non-Arabic speaking population of Muslims, there is, they comprise of the majority, right? The majority of Muslims are non-Arabic speaking Muslims. They comprise of the majority. A small percentage of them know and have the knowledge of classical Arabic. Whereas Muslims of the past across the Muslim world were known to have at least a functional knowledge of Arabic, meaning that even if it wasn't their primary tongue, they learned a good portion of it. And so unacquaintance with Fusha, with classical Arabic, results in this disconnect from the primary sources of Islam. And so this is a relatively newer phenomena over the past 2 or 3 centuries. And it has been expedited due to various factors. Expedited due to colonialism, expedited due to the downfall of Islamic governance, changing the education system. Also, an intentional subverting of Muslim languages besides Arabic, Persian, Urdu, etc. And so this cultural imperialism extends beyond colonialism, and this is a result of this. But despite all of this, despite the fact that there is a widespread illiteracy and despite the fact there's a widespread religious and spiritual illiteracy, the Qur'an remains the uncontested source of Muslim thought, of Muslim practice, of Muslim belief. And it is the kalam Allah. It is the speech of Allah revealed to humanity through Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And so as Muslims, we believe that the Qur'an was revealed and its descent from Allahul Mahfuz to was within the realm of time, descending into the spoken language of Arabic. And this was at a time in which Arabic was at its peak. And Sunni belief is that the Qur'an is kalam Allah, transcending time and space. And that's why it cannot be properly translated. Because of that reason, that we believe that is kalam Allah, it will never be fully translated. And so the Qur'an describes itself as لا يأتيه الباطل من بين يديه ولا من خلفه, that no falsehood can come to the Qur'an, not from the front nor from the rear. تنزيل من حكيم حميد. It is a revelation from above. And so the Arabic revelation, بلسان عربي مبين, this Arabic revelation consecrated the Arabic language, meaning it made the language sacred. The revelation is what made the language sacred. And so the language becomes a recipient of tremendous attention now due to this. And its safeguarding is necessary as a means for the safeguarding and protection of the Qur'an from distortion. And so what did the Muslims start to do? They started to preserve etymology. They mapped it out. The roots of every word were preserved, providing access to fundamental linguistic meanings of words, and there resulted furu'at, their branches. Syntax was preserved and mapped out, types of sentences, expressions, ordering of words. And so there is historical linguistic variations that occur in every language. But because this language was sacred, these historical linguistic variations would not affect the Quran and its message. And so that is part of the mu'jiza, the i'jaz, the inimitability of the Quran. It lies in its linguistic expressions, but beyond that, the i'jaz of the Quran is in its vivid imagery. The i'jaz of the Quran is in its impactful oath. It lies in its profound parables, the amthal, the aqsam. It has to do with the dialectical and syllogistic formulations that it provides to its listeners. And it leaves a visible impact on the reciters and the listeners of the Quran. And so all of these aspects of the i'jaz that I just mentioned, whether it be the oath, the imagery, the parables, the dialectical and syllogistic formulations, all of these are aspects of the i'jaz that absorb the heart, that awe the intellect, and it creates this insatiable thirst for more, which is why the Quran is described as bahrun la sahila lah, an ocean without a shore, because you can always reap more, you can always draw more from the Quran. But because of that, it also rendered them incapable of exactly producing its translation and its expression in another language in its full form. And so, Muslims recite the Quran muta'abbad bi tilawatihi. The fact that you recite it is an ibadah, even if you do not know exactly what it is meaning, what its meanings are. There is an ibadah tied in with simply its recitation. And that recitation is only in Arabic. So no matter, the fahm of the Quran is a separate ibadah. Understanding the Quran is a separate ibadah. Reciting the Quran is its own ibadah. And so, linguistic barriers notwithstanding, Muslims still understand the overall essential message of the Quran. But this, however, does not suffice, as a Muslim must have functional knowledge of the Quran for his daily life. So the declining religious literacy has motivated some contemporary Muslims to step towards increasing the religious literacy by attempting to understanding the Quran through a translation. And some will go further and select commentaries, tafasir that are translated, and read those as well. Now, this effort of trying to understand the Quran through a translation is commendable, and it is necessary, and it may convey a basic understanding. But it is also, if one does it in isolation, both intellectually and spiritually fraught and deficient. And that's because a translation is mediated, it's conditioned by its era, place, and standpoint of the person translating. And so not only the reader's linguistic limitations, but their lack of sufficient training to read the Quran, it enlarges this complication. And so the lack of training leaves the Quran, especially someone who has this Western style of education, at the mercy of textual patterns, which may not conform to the Arabic of the Quran. And that leaves them bereft of comprehending what the Quran is, which is fawq al-aql, supra-rational. And that's the nature of the Quran. And when the Quran is understood that it is fawq al-aql, supra-rational nature of the Quran, it engages with the inner faculties of qalb, aql, and nafs, heart, mind and soul. And so the numerous translations of Islamic texts on the Quran published recently in recent decades is helpful. But one cannot avail much from the wealth of Islamic scholarship on the Quran without proper training, mentorship, and a specific structured learning, which is within the language itself and beyond that as well. So, but the Quran, Muslims are going to present the Quran to non-Muslims as well. This is the practice of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he once Utbah ibn Rabi'ah was conversing with the Quraysh, and he said to the Quraysh, ألا أقوم إلى محمد فأعرض عليه أمورا لعله أن يقبل بعضها. That, maybe in the earlier stages of revelation, Utbah came and he said, maybe I'll tell Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I'll tell Muhammad that if you do this and this, if we give you this and this, you'll abandon this Islam, you'll abandon this Quran. And so they said, go ahead, Ya Abul Walid, go ahead, go and approach Muhammad. And so Utbah comes to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam and he says, Ya ibn akhi, innaka minna haythu alimt min as-sultah fi al-ashira wal-makan fi al-nasab. فقام إليه عتبة حتى جلس إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال يا ابن أخي إنك منا. Right? That you are part of us. إن كنت تريد بما جئت به من هذا الأمر ما لا جمعنا لك من أموالنا حتى تكون أكثرنا مالا. We will give you the most wealth. We will make you the richest person. To abandon this? We'll make you the king of Mecca if you abandon this. If it's women you seek, we'll marry you off to the most beautiful women. But if abandon this. And so he kept going, proposing to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam different things until Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam stood there silently listening to him. And then at the end he said, أَوَقَدْ فَرَغْتِ يَا أَبَا الْوَلِيدِ. Are you done? Are you done yet? And he said, now, فَاسْمَعْ مِنِّي. Listen to what I have to say. He said, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Hamim. تنزيل من الرحمن الرحيم كتاب فصلت آياته قرآنا عربيا لقوم يعلمون. And he continued to recite from these ayat. And it affected Utbah, knew the Quran, he understood Fusha. So it impacted him greatly, to the extent that when he came back to the Quraysh, his face had changed. And he couldn't fathom what he had just heard. And they told him, he tried to convince them, leave Muhammad, let him go, do not interfere. But they did what they did, as the seerah says. So the Quran dealt with non-Muslims from the get-go. It's not as if we won't present the Quran to non-Muslims. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam himself did it. This ayah, شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس. It's a guidance for mankind. So the world is a global neighborhood now. There's a lot of interrelations that occur. But one thing as Muslims we have to be aware of, that what is the pulse of academia in the West. Academic scholars in the West face this dilemma when approaching the Quran, and that is to maintain a agnostic detachment from the Quran, from the object of their study. But we as Muslims, the trajectory of our engagement with the Quran is determined first by settling this fundamental issue. What is the Quran? It is Kalamullah. So if you cannot set the fundamental issue of authorship to Allah Ta'ala, either by accepting that it is Kalamullah or rejecting it, your research and your view on the Quran is going to be tainted. And a corollary imperative, what follows that, is to accept or reject Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam as the final messenger. And so that is important to understand when academic academia presents to us their research on the Qur'an. And so we'll see the flaws that has brought up later on. So we come to now translation. In Arabic, we call translating tarjama. And translation is part of the exegetical rope of interpretation. It's part of tafsir. In Arabic, the word translation means تبليغ الكلام لمن لم يبلغه, conveying the message. The word tarjama can mean simply conveying the message. Another meaning of tarjama can be تفسير الكلام بلغته التي جاء بها. So rephrasing it. Now, Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma was called Tarjuman al-Qur'an. He was called Tarjuman al-Qur'an. But he wasn't translating the Qur'an from one language to another. Right? He was called the quote-unquote translator of the Qur'an. What was he doing? He was explaining the Qur'an. He was rephrasing it in other words. And so, تفسير الكلام بلغة غير لغته. So doing an idiomatic translation or a linear translation. نقل الكلام من لغة إلى أخرى. So these are all underpinnings of the word tarjama in Arabic. And so before we come to the qualifications required to do tarjama, we have to step back and look at the qualifications necessary to do tafsir. So being trained in the Arabic instrumental sciences is necessary. The alat, the instrumental sciences, knowing one's morphology, etymology, syntax, knowing how the language works is essential. And then along with that, you have the aliyat, the Islamic intellectual and academic sciences, namely tafsir, hadith, fiqh, aqidah, and their antecedent ulum. And along with that, there's the dhatiyat, the moral and ethical qualifications. A person who you take the Qur'an from should be a person who is mukhlis, someone who is sincere, one who has tawakkul, one who is free of the afatul qalb, ma'ayibun nafs, someone who practices khashyah, tadabbur, iman bil ghaib, etc. This is the pedagogy of tarbiyah. Tarbiyah in Arabic is وصول الشيء إلى كماله تدريجا. That you reach the perfection of something slowly. The Quran came to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam's Mubarak heart over a span of 23 years. You are not going to get it quickly. It took Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam's blessed, pure Mubarak heart to receive the Quran in this method, right? In وصول الشيء إلى كماله تدريجا, that you reach to one's pinnacle slowly, step by step. So you can just imagine the heart of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and then you cannot even compare it to anyone else. So these are the qualifications for tafsir. But then there are additional qualifications for tarjama, because English has its own dictates of grammar and rhetoric that need to be upheld. English dialects change from time and place. So the person needs to be a lexical polymath. He needs to be a societal polymath because of the fact that he needs to know how certain words are used. The best the translator can do is transfer the meanings of the Quran in accordance with the utmost of his knowledge, efforts, and skill. But remember, the difference will remain between the revealed utterance and the reported meaning. There will always be a difference between that. And so, وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَحَاطَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا. Allah is the one that can encompass everything in the micro and macro. So translation will continue. It'll never cease. One's ongoing study of the Quran, of Arabic, of Islam and its sciences, new discoveries of man in various spheres of life will enrich future translations in different ways. So now that we have the conditions of both tafsir and tarjuma briefly in our mind, let's look at some of the impediments related to translation. For example, you have to understand that the Qur'an is of oral origin, not written. It is of oral origin. And so the oral origin of Arabic rhetoric, it cannot be confined to the written word. And so for example, there is no, in the oral origin of Arabic, there is no punctuation. Right? That punctuation is not in commas, apostrophes, exclamation points. That the articles of emphasis in Arabic are different, right? To translate لَنَفْعَلَنَّ, for translate inna ka'anna, to translate, they may have archaic English usages like lo, verily, alas, which to contemporary sensibilities may actually subtract from the text depending on where you are. But even with this limited prism through which we are viewing the Quran, the light shines through, even in a translation. The light still shines through. But these are impediments and challenges to translating. For example, in verbs, Arabic has a separate form for the dual. Right? There's no single word to convey that sense in English because English works in singulars and plurals. So one of the reasons why people enjoy reading Surah Al-Rahman is because of the rhythm and rhyme in Surah Al-Rahman, and that comes from the duality. فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ. That comes from the duality of the language, and so that's not conveyed in English because English works in singulars and plurals. Same can be said for feminine plurals in the second and third person. In English, both genders, and there's only two, right? Both genders are represented by you and they. And so all forms of translation, whether they be linear, whether they be word for word, whether they be idiomatic, are going to be different because the words of each language contain within it many shades of meaning. And that can add to the ambiguity. But the Quran holds a unique and immeasurable position amongst us as Muslims, which is rarely understood by others. The position of the Quran to Muslims is rarely understood by individuals who are outside of the fold of Islam. And so the challenge of the Quran, meaning the ayat al-tahaddi, فَلْيَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ, right? These challenging ayat, they remain today. So any doubters who want to try and produce the like of the Quran will not be able to do so because these ayat present the impossibility of true and completely accurate translation. With that, there are some principles that we want to abide by when translating. So clarity and literary quality in its English expression is important. We want to have the main objectives of the Quran in mind. When looking at translations, we may need to look at a few different ones to understand what the Quran is trying to convey. Commentary from other major Arabic tafsir literature also, it helps. So there will always be room for creativity in representing Kalamullah. There will always be room for creativity in representing the divine text. You know, yesterday we talked about the story of Ja'far radiallahu anhu in front of Najashi, how he creatively represented the divine text, right, from Surah Maryam to Najashi. But these principles listed here of translation exist because translation itself is a necessity. If I were to write a paragraph on the board and I would ask each one of you to rephrase that paragraph in your own words. And you would, I give you 10, 15 minutes to rephrase that paragraph in your own words. The fact that you can rephrase it in your own words shows that you understood the language, you understood the paragraph. If someone just recopied the same paragraph, communication may have occurred, but understanding didn't. Right? When you ask a child to tell you about the Bill of Rights, and they just have it memorized and they regurgitate it to you, that doesn't show that they understand the Bill of Rights. It shows that they have memorized it. So translation is important because it shows comprehension. It shows fahm. So translation and interpretation is essential in all language, and it's a necessity that we have to deal with. At this stage, I'll take a pause for any questions before I start getting into some examples of translations. If anyone has any questions, تفضل.
How many years ago did you say people still spoke or understood functional Arabic?
About 2 or 3 centuries ago.
MashaAllah.
Yeah. The question was, how long ago did people still have a functional knowledge of Arabic, of classical Arabic? And that was, 2 or 3 centuries ago. You could see that. And then, like I stated, there are certain things that occurred in the past few centuries that led to a accelerated, denigration of education within that sphere. Yes, go ahead.
I'm just making an observation that it seems like when we talk about Ibn Abbas being Tarjumat al-Quran, and the example that you gave, that when you have a sentence and you rephrase it, it shows fahm rather than just root memorization. It does seem most likely that to truly understand the Quran from the presentation so far, that one has to engage in the Arabic language and cannot solely rely on any other translation to really appreciate the Quran in itself. So is that understanding correct? Is this what you are telling the audience and all of us, is to engage the Quran in Arabic and not really focus so much on the Tarjuma?
Yes, the question is in terms of engagement of the Quran and the primary aspect of it. The Quran is not the Quran in any other language. Like when they define the Quran, it is bilisanin arabiyyin mubin. It is in the Arabic language. So when you read a translation, if you get to the nitty gritty of it, you're not actually reading the Quran, right? When you read a translation or you read an explanation, that is not the Quran. The Quran is wrapped within the language, and so it is important to differentiate that. So when people say, I have questions in regards to the Quran, you have to take a step back and go to the actual Arabic and actually bring them to this standard. Even if they are here, you have to bring them to the standard. And so there's a example, many examples of this that we will inshallah go through. We'll start with some a range of different mistakes made in translation. Some of these are not as problematic as others, but it's still important to look at. One English translator that we have probably engaged with is Marmaduke Pickthall, Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall. He passed away in the 1930s. He was a son of an Anglican priest, and he himself was a novelist. He embraced Islam in 1914, and he migrated to India. And he was working for an Indian newspaper. He completed his translation under the patronage of the Nizam of Hyderabad. So if you're Hyderabadi, you can pat yourself on the back. his translation can seem archaic in character, and it seems that he was giving the English Muslim something more similar to the English Bible. But for the most part, his translation is good, and it has benefit. The example I posted here for you all to look at is from Surah An-Nisa. And particularly, if you look at the second portion of the ayah where it says, وَاسْتَغْفَرَ لَهُمُ الرَّسُولُ لَوَجَدُوا اللَّهَ تَوَّابًا رَحِيمًا. And so he translated this as, and asked forgiveness of the messenger. So what he did was he replaced the subject with the object. It's the messenger asked forgiveness for them, right? And so this is a small mistake that he has made here. Another mistake in Marmaduke Pickthall's translation is from Surah Al-Ma'idah. This ayah, it was revealed in the context of certain things that were previously prohibited, previously allowed, were now prohibited for Muslims to consume. And so the Muslims currently asked Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam that we had brethren who passed away who consumed these things, and they are now haram. What does this mean? And so these ayat were revealed. لَيْسَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ جُنَاهٌ فِيمَا طَعِمُوا. That there is no junah, sin, onto those who believe and do good works for what they have eaten in the past. Meaning, in that context, they have already passed away. And then he says, إِذَا مَتَّقَوْا وَآمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ ثُمَّ اتَّقَوْا وَآمَنُوا ثُمَّ اتَّقَوْا وَأَحْسَنُوا. He translates this as, so be mindful of your duty to Allah and believe and do good works. Anyone know the mistake he is making? He's translating a past tense as an imperative, right? He's translating a past tense. إِذَا مَتَّقَوْا وَآمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ is past tense. He's translating this as an imperative, as a command. So be mindful of your duty and believe. Whereas in regards to those who were mindful and did believe. So this, again, smaller mistake. The larger mistakes comes from individuals who have, when we think about this slide what I was speaking about earlier, the qualifications of a mufassir. If you are not careful, there are translations that are out there that are promoted and given that have huge theological problems. For example, this reformist translation of the Qur'an, there's, when you read the introduction to this, it literally states this as a subsection within the introduction. Do we need Muhammad to understand the Qur'an? This is a passage, a section within the introduction that says this, that do we need Muhammad to understand the Qur'an? And so when this Qur'an only module, which is very deceiving, it's actually to remove Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam from the picture. And because of that, the entire hadith corpus from the picture of understanding. And so these individuals have many problems. And so this is one such mistake that they made. In Surah An-Nazi'at, وَالْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ دَحَاهَا. And so the focus in this reformist translation is that they want to present this Quran through a scientific lens or a mathematical lens or whatever it is that they want to speak about. And so if you read the reformist translation, it states the land after that, dahaha, he made it like an egg, right? Dahaha. There are many things there they just included. And so this results from a lack of knowledge in regards to Arabic. The word daha is a verb. So it's a verb, it has a subject and an object, dahaha. So he alone spread it is the translation from Ahmad Zaki Hamad that I have given you there. And that's an accurate translation because the word daha refers to basata, to expand. But the reason why, where did they come up with it is like an egg? Where did they come up, with that translation? It's a lack of knowledge in regards to Arabic. When an ostrich lays its egg, uh, the Arabs call that adhan na'ama. Adhan na'ama, meaning the ostrich tramples its nest to expand it, to lay its egg. And so the word dahaha comes from the word dahi, right, which means egg. It doesn't actually mean egg. It means to spread, and this is a conflation from their misunderstanding of the language, and so that's where that misunderstanding comes from. But this is not surprising, given that they are trying to prove a particular aspect. Another reformist explanation. So in Surah Ali Imran, you have this ayah, شهد الله أنه لا إله إلا هو. So لا إله إلا هو. And what they're saying, that this expression of لا إله إلا هو, it occurs 30 times in the Qur'an, and it's not in conjunction with another name. Again, the shahadatain, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. Why are they saying this? To remove Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam from the picture, right? To remove. And so these ayat, even in Surah Al-Isra, وَإِذَا ذَكَرْتَ رَبَّكَ فِي الْقُرْآنِ وَحْدَهُ, right? Wahdah, they alone, you mention Allah Ta'ala. They use this ayat to discredit the entire hadith genre. And so what the Quran itself speaks about, including Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, قُلْ أَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَالرَّسُولَ, right? مَنْ يُطِعِ الرَّسُولَ فَقَدْ أَطَاعَ اللَّهِ, right? The one who obeys Allah and His Messenger. If you obey the Messenger, you have obeyed Allah. So this needs to be aware, because all these trickle down into what they are trying to explain. Another aspect of this appears in Surah Al-Najm. وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. So they claim that the pronoun in وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ is not referring to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, right? And clearly the objective is to remove him from the picture. But if you look at the initial ayat of Surah Al-Najm, it is referring to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam's experience of receiving wahi. And this is substantiated by the dichotomy of wahi matlu and wahi ghayr matlu. Right? Revelation that is recited, meaning the Qur'an, and revelation that is not recited, referring to hadith. So Sunni explanation is always going to be cogent, holistic. It's always going to be consistent with the main goal of najat, with the main goal of salvation, not to prove a scientific theory or disprove it. That is secondary. Okay? And so if they're removing Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam from the picture, what do you think they're doing with the Sahaba? Okay? And so this ayah, we talked about this yesterday as well. فَإِنْ آمَنُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا آمَنْتُمْ بِهِ فَقَدْ اهْتَدَوْا. All right, they have a section in Surah Al-Ahzab titled "Hypocrites Amongst the Companions of the Prophet," which is an oxymoron. Right? You cannot be a munafiq and a sahabi. Right? The munafiqeen are not part of the Sahaba. But if you look at the Quranic description of the Sahaba, this ayah in Surah Al-Fath, Muhammadur Rasulullah walladhina ma'ahu ashidda'u 'ala al-kuffari ruhama'u bainahum. There's no comment there, no explanation there, because of the fact that their goal is to remove Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam from the picture. Their goal is to remove the Sahaba from the picture, because once you do that, it becomes much easier to twist the meanings of the Quran according to the conclusions that you have already to force them into this. And so sectarian translations is not something new, right? This reformist translation is not something new. The Qadiani religion, which is a separate religion, right, they are not Muslim, right? And this is not a you know, a um, a fault of ours to say this out loud, right? The term Qadiani, it originates from the term Qadian, which was a small town in northern India, the birthplace of Mirza Ghulam. So it's not a slur. They make it seem as if, oh, we called him Qadian. It's a slur. It's not a slur. Right? They want to call themselves Ahmadi, but we won't call them Ahmadi. كلمة حق أريد بها الباطل. They try to call themselves Qur'an only, the reformists. We don't call them Qur'ani, we call them Hadith rejectors. These individuals like to call themselves Ahmadi, but we won't call them Ahmadi. كلمة حق أريد بها الباطل. They intend something false with that statement, and that is trying to add themselves to the fold of Islam. And so one of the initial Qadiani translators, Abdul Hakim Khan, he was translating this ayah, which is speaking about Isa alayhi salam. Inni mutawaffika wa rafi'uk. And he, if you look at the first edition, which was published, you know, in 1905, he was a very close follower of Mirza Ghulam, and so he translated this with the idea that this ayah is referring to Mirza Ghulam in his commentary. And then he left Mirza Ghulam. And so in his second edition, he removed that kabit. And so this is you know, the way that he translated it, it may not have been completely you know, inaccurate. But for the purpose of him trying to attach this foreign element to the structure of Islam, must be recognized and known. And so there is no ta'arud in the Qur'an. There is no contradiction in the Qur'an. And so this corrupt belief that they had that he died a natural death, and this is not in reference to the you know, second appearance of Isa alayhi salam, you know, that is something that is false. Another translator that is known in English is George Sale. He was a British Oriental individual, lawyer by profession, and his translation was called the Qur'an, commonly called Al-Qur'an of Muhammad, as if Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam authored this. And it was historically a landmark in terms of Qur'an translations in English, and it was popular. And George Sale did not translate this from Arabic to English. He based his translation on a Latin translation by a Catholic priest. And so this individual is not even translating from Arabic to English. He's translating from Latin to English. So imagine what was lost from Arabic to Latin, and then from Latin to English. And so he is an individual. His Quran translation is famous in the U.S. because the third U.S. president, Thomas Jefferson, brought it over to America, and in 1765. And this picture that is here is taken from the Library of Congress Jefferson exhibit. And so when you go there, you'll see this translation there. And a more contemporary translation is A.J. Arbery's translation, entitled The Qur'an Interpreted. And though he's not Muslim, is generally free of anti-Muslim prejudice and distortion. And even in his intro, he acknowledges that the Qur'an, in his eyes, could be of divine origin. In the translation, again, I'm highlighting it because it's part of Oxford World Classic series, and it's intended for an educated audience, which is why it's popularly used in colleges and universities. A.J. Arbery, passed away in the 1960s. So the ayah that I'm highlighting here is from both of their translations, from Surah Yusuf. وَكَذَلِكَ يَجْتَبِيكَ وَيُعَلِّمُكَ مِنْ تَأْوِيلِ الْأَحَادِيثِ. So the term ta'wil al-ahadith, Sale translates it as dark sayings. And that comes from, probably regarding what it was referring to in its Latin translation. Arbery translates it as interpretation of tales. Again, Yusuf alayhi salam, this ta'wil al-ahadith is in reference to his interpretation of dreams. And the ilm that was given to Yusuf alayhi salam from previous scriptures. And this is wrapped in the way that our aqidah of who Anbiya alayhimus salatu wasalam are, what form of ilm and hikmah were given to them. And so other translations, translate this as interpretation of dreams or interpretation of foreshadowed events. Another English translation is Rodwell's translation. He was, again, an English Oriental clergyman of the Church of England. And one of his achievements was translating the Qur'an into an English version. And so he is very combative in his, he's not as combative in his tone as Sale and Ross, but he also, one thing that he does is he completely abandons the sequence of the surahs, and he attempts to put the Quran in a more readable form in what he deems to be chronological, given the linear historical record. And so he translates this ayah very false. فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْحَرْ, pray to your Lord and slay the victims. وَانْحَرْ, he translates slay the victims. Is one har, obviously, is referring to the nahar of Buddha, of camels, slaughtering camels, which was khiyaru amwal al-Arab, the prized possession of Arabs. And so nahar itself refers to mawdi al-qilada min as-sadr. So it's referring to the slaughtering of animals. So again, a mistranslation here. Another translation that I want to highlight here that stems from, from within the fold of Muslim scholarship is that of Muhammad Mahmud Ghali. He was a professor of linguistics and Islamic studies and founder of Azhar's Faculty of Language and Translation. And so he had this translation titled Towards Understanding the Ever Glorious Qur'an. And so, and he had his main contribution in Arabic was a book on mutaradifat fil Qur'an al-Majid, synonyms in the Qur'an. And so Ghali, he praises previous translations, Yusuf Ali, Pickthall, Arbery. But one thing that you notice here in Ghali's translation, English is not his mother tongue. And so in this ayah, وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا, he translates this as do not be a constant adversary of the treacherous. And adversary means opponent, rival, enemy. What he meant to say was advocate. And so this is just, advocate is upholder, champion of. And so he seems to have confused the English word advocate with the word adversary, which is opposite in meaning, right? So this, again, translation requires both skills. It requires the skill of knowing what the Quran is saying and and the language that it is being conveyed in. So these are some common mistakes. And inshallah, we can open the floor for questions again.
The translations that the Qadianis have done, are they completely unreliable in terms of, or should we just take it as simply non-Muslim? Or are there many other mistakes in that they're trying to cover?
Yes. The Qadiani translations, one shouldn't rely on them at all. The only reason one would engage with them is simply for the purpose of sharpening their own sword. strengthening their own pen, for that academic engagement to show why it's false. From an accuracy perspective, obviously they have they don't believe in khatm al-nubuwah. Simple as that, right? They do not believe in the finality of Prophet Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Along with that, you have because of that, they have changed other aqaid. Right? The nuzul of Isa alayhi salam, the denial of that, the revelation of the Qur'an into certain aspects of removing the Sahaba radiallahu anhum from the picture. So there are some portions in which the mistakes will be much more glaring, such as the example I gave from Surah Al-Ma'idah. And there are other places where it may not seem so impactful. But as a whole, the ones that would be engaging with that would be for the purpose of not for the purpose of ta'lim, not for the purpose of educating or recognizing the meaning of the Qur'an, because the lens from which you view the Qur'an, even if it's not completely false, it still has an impact. And so if you're reading their translation for the purpose of understanding the Qur'an, it's going to trickle down. So the reason, again, reading a translation is not ibadah. Reciting the Qur'an in Arabic, that is the ibadah. And when you talk about recommending translations, Ahmed Zaki Hamad's translation is a good one. Pickthall, Yusuf Ali, these are good translations from within Muslims who are both skilled in the tradition, as well as they can represent it in English as well. So that's there, but the oral aspect of the Qur'an gets lost in translation, as if remember, there was a time in which Muslims, even in reading the Qur'an, you wouldn't just buy a mushaf from the store. وَإِنَّكَ لَتُلَقَّى الْقُرْآنَ مِنْ لَدُنْ حَكِيمٍ عَلِيمٍ. This Qur'an came through talaqqi, from Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam from Jibreel to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And the Sahaba radiallahu anhum didn't focus on buying mushafs. They took it from Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And it goes, that's the tradition. The oral tradition is the standard. And so reading translations, like I stated, is a necessity. It is needed, but it should not be the primary focus. No.
Well, some of the translations by non-Muslims, such as from Latin into English, and these reverends that are doing translations, they obviously have different beliefs. They don't believe in the Quran. Is there any documentation of their motivation of why they did this? Obviously, it was hard work, many hours. They could do other things. But what was their motivation for translating the Quran specifically?
There could be different motivations for translating. The question is in regards to why would non-Muslims engage with the Quran? Anything that, even if you look at it outside of the Quran, texts that are seminal cultural works, there is room for engagement, room for understanding why it is the way that it is. Why do people think this way? For example, Rumi's Mathnawi, people engage with that. Kalila wa Dimna in Farsi. There's engagement with these things due to the literary standard that they hold. And so from that literary standard, there's a cultural aspect that for Christians especially, there is a commonality for Jews and Christians to engage with the Quran because they see themselves, them being addressed directly. The stories of the Prophet ﷺ, one of the reasons that the Quran speaks about those prophets specifically that Bani Israel and the Jews and Christians knew of was to seize control from them. No longer were the Jews considered the authority in Medina, because now the Quran spoke about Musa alayhi salam. Now the Quran spoke about Dawood and Sulaiman alayhi salam. So it seized control from them. They no longer controlled the narrative. And so with that came their engagement, right? So, for example, the Quran says, وَمَا كَفَرَ سُلَيْمَانَ وَلَكِنَّ الشَّيَاطِينَ كَفَرُوا. This stems from the fact that the Jews considered Sulaiman alayhi salam to just be a sahir, not a nabi. And so the Quran seizes control from them and takes control of the narrative. And so that's one of the reasons why they, and especially Jews and Christians, continuously engage with the Quran, because there is a shared overlap, both in story, some in doctrine. And the Quran says it itself, تَعَالَوْا إِلَى كَلِمَةٍ سَوَاءٍ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمْ. Come to an equitable word between you and I.
So is there an organization that read these translations and flag any issues, maybe give feedback to those authors?
Yeah, the question is there an organization that reads these translations and flags certain issues? If you open up any translation, even if you open up a mushaf, you will see that there is a lajna. There is a group of scholars that authenticate this mushaf. I have seen, for example, masahif being passed out in prisons, in places that have changed the Arabic text, not just the English text. They've changed the Arabic text, and so it's very important to read the intro and to see the authenticity and the documentation of that. And it's usually mentioned in the cover page in the verso or the in the index. But then there are certain translations that are sponsored by governments, right? And for example, the Shawariullah translated the Quran from Arabic to Farsi. His translation is called Fath al-Rahman. The Afghanistan government recently had a translation of Sheikh al-Hind and Allama Shabir Ahmad Usmani's translation. So government translations are there, whether it be from Muslim governments in the past or in the present. And so those are there. And but even with that, one should approach a scholar of the field and ask what do they think about this translation. And there are certain ayat that if there are red flags raised, there are certain ayat that one can point to. But one should generally read translations that have the Arabic text within it. So at least you can engage with the Arabic alongside with the translated language. And in English, the word for word doesn't fit as well because the language reads left to right. In Urdu, it's a bit easier, as well as in Farsi, because the language still goes from right to left. So there are many things to consider, but reading the introduction and then looking at governmental translations, as well as approaching a scholar in the field, those would be the steps to go by. جزاكم الله خيرا. سبحان الله بحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.